Hello, y'all. Welcome back. This is going to be lecture six. It's going to be chapter 9. Democracy or dictatorship, does it make a difference? So basically, the basic question here is, does democracy or dictatorship have any bearing on GDP growth or your likelihood to succeed as an economy? And there are three suggestions as to what could bring about different different relations with the economy between different types of systems. The first is property rights. The second is consumption versus investment. And the third is dictatorial authority, or the argument that democracy is inefficient because of all of the checks and balances. Okay, so we'll talk about property rights first, right? So, what are property rights? Basically, it means you have the rule of law in your system, you have geographic rights on land, contract enforcement and mediation through a judicial system. Arbitrary asset seizure is difficult, right? And it becomes standardized, like eminent domain in the United States, where you have to pay for the land at a fair market value. You have to have a true government reason for taking the land or appropriating the land. And again, you have to pay for it, where that isn't necessarily the case in dictatorships, right? So the idea is that theoretically, all of this should reduce risk for investors and encourage investment. But they do point out that this is the idealized case, right? Um, and they also point out that a lot of the literature says that it's not actually about property rights per se, or democracy per se. It's rather rule of law, right? Are there standardized procedures for contract right disputes, contract mediation, purchases of government, promises that expropriation of foreign direct investment will not occur, things like this. That is far more important than democracy itself. And sort of the causality between democracy and GDP growth is rather tenuous, especially when you start controlling for things like rule of law, because there are dictatorships, obviously, with high levels of rule of law. Um, and so, yeah, Barrow points out that there are states where you can have high levels of rule of law, but not democracy, and still be relatively prosperous, right? So you've got Chile under Augusto Pinochet in the 70s. You've got Singapore for a long, long time, which is just kicking butt in the international arena because of its high human development and high um, sort of investment in human capital and high level technologies, things like that. You have Iran before all the sanctions were doing pretty well under the dictatorship, mostly because of oil. Arguably, China, for the past 20 years since they opened up economically and tightened down politically, they have high levels of rule of law, but not democracy in any sense. And you could think of, a couple other countries like Saudi Arabia and also the former South Korea before they democratized in the late 80s. So the point here is that there are a lot of examples, actually, of dictatorships that have really great economic outcomes because of rule of law, not because of democracy. And so we need to sort of, be wary of this idea that democracy is causing great GDP growth, right? And rather, the idea here is that what you're doing by promoting the rule of law is reducing risk for investors, right? Reducing the likelihood that their assets will be expropriated, reducing the risk that the laws will just be changed overnight, and their assets will be forfeitured or they won't be able to leave the country through things like capital flight. And so, as you reduce risk and uncertainty, you should get better economic outcomes, right? Um, okay, then they sort of move on to this discussion of redistribution, right? Really interesting discussion. And there are some that argue that, like, no matter which political party nor which um, institutions exist, massive redistribution is not really possible, right? So whether you have a dictatorship or a democracy, and whether you have a leftist or a rightist government in your democracy, it doesn't matter, because for the most part, there is an equilibrium that you are looking for, right, when it comes to redistribution versus asset investment. And if you go too far in either direction, you become economically inefficient. So we'll talk about that here in a little while. But just know that, one of the big arguments, especially, of course, from people like Marx, is that there's just this huge tension between rich and poor in democracies, right? And that elections often can inevitably come down to rich versus poor. Um, and so the idea here is that, while some may claim that dictatorships don't respect property rights, there's no there's no actual mechanism like the vote in a democracy to be used against the rich. Whereas in democracies, the poor could expropriate or change the rules of property rights. They're not set in stone, right? And so property right changes could occur under a democracy arguably easier um, than under a dictatorship. Excuse me. So there are a couple of problems with this idea. First, we know that the poor tend to vote at much lesser rates than the rich, so that washes out the effect a little bit. And then you also get this growth versus equality argument. So if you look at figure 9.3, where they show this curve, the trade offs between growth and equality, M is the equilibrium, right? That's where we want. Let me move this over a little bit. I can't really see it. Shift it, shift it. There we go. Okay. M is the pure equilibrium, right? So you've got basically the wealthy on one end and the wage earners on the other, right? So we're thinking of this from a Marxist perspective, right? You've basically got the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And the bourgeoisie are the owners of capital, right? And they are the main profit takers in a society. And then you have the wage earners who generally want some semblance of redistribution so that the ultra rich have to give out some to the poor and the middle class, right? The problem is that we're stuck at M, right? So we have the wage earners' preferences and the profit takers' preferences on the solid line from P to W. But the problem is there's this curve of efficiency inside of the model, and this is like the government efficiency curve, basically. So the more profit taking that the government allows, right? You allow sort of almost a plutarchy, then your economy is going to take a bit of a hit, right? Because you're not investing, excuse me, enough in things like assets, factories, human development, and even in the government services like bridges and dams and roads and education systems and good schools, et cetera, that a profit taker needs, right? Um, on the other end of the spectrum is if you redistribute wealth too much, then you also get economic inefficiency. Your dotted line, the sort of, what is it? I guess they don't really have it labeled, but the line where the dotted line meets the solid line of PW, it also shows that once you move away from the M equilibrium and you get too much redistribution, you get economic inefficiency, you get less spending, you get higher unemployment, you get lower GDP growth, right? So, in a sense, under this understanding of the way that politics works out and the way that either too much profit for the bourgeoisie or too much redistribution to the proletariat, or as they call it, the profit takers and the wage earners, um, then you get a more inefficient economy. Either way you move. So the regardless of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, or you're a Christian Democrat, or in the Green Party in Germany, or you're a dictator or you're a democracy, it does not matter according to these, because you have to be to have the most efficient economy on the M equilibrium, right? And so basically, they say, if too many taxes are taken, the rich will simply consume, or they will participate in capital flight, right, rather than investing, and the economy can weaken. And so we get extreme examples of capital flight. So if you look at Argentina, a couple times, sadly, when they have sort of reneged on their IMF debts, capital just flooded out of their system, and now they have laws saying that you can't move your capital in and move it out within 6 months or something like that. South Africa, post-apartheid, everybody thought things were just going to completely collapse, and so most of the wealth fled the country. And then if you look at the Asian financial crisis of 1997, where you've got countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and others, their currencies completely collapsing. This is another case of capital flight. And basically, structural Marxists would say that the government knows this. Like, they know for a fact that this is what will happen. And what they tend to prefer is growth over equality, right? And so you'll get a growth model rather than a more equal distribution model, regardless of the government that exists. And unfortunately, if equality is the goal rather than growth, you get some pretty devastating outcomes from that. First, growth tends to fall, the economy slows, and the government takes in less taxation, right? And the government needs at least the level of taxation to provide the level of goods in the next year, and probably 2% more to keep up with inflation. Unemployment rises, which again pressures the government because now they have to allay more of their intake towards um, welfare redistribution programs or food programs or free lunch programs, things like this. And it also, we know that high unemployment rates tend to put a lot of pressure on governments. And then third, if capital flight reduces the amount of the redistribution to be had in general, the whole project is moot, right? So if half of the capital floods out of your country, what you have left to redistribute is not all that helpful, right? So yeah, there's some real problems with trying to like completely envision this redistribution model, this utopian redistribution thing, right? And again, this sort of means that ideology doesn't matter, democracy doesn't matter, dictatorship doesn't matter, left versus right doesn't matter, because all you're going to be doing is increasing inefficiencies. And it's also a fact, I guess, that we should learn, since we talked about sectorals. Is your economy based on oil or agriculture, or is it human development and technology and services, etc.? Where it is non-liquid, right, like oil and things, this is where you get high levels of redistribution without affecting wealth too much, right? And so these are countries like Saudi Arabia where they could just pay off their citizens and everyone can have a cushy a government job that doesn't really function as anything, just to draw sort of a state pension. Um, and I would also point out that, again, giving the rich more than the equilibrium is also suboptimal and will also cause major problems in your economy. So I'm not saying redistribution bad, giving money to rich good. I'm saying both can tend to have devastating consequences. Okay, their next argument is about consumption versus investment. Um, Basically, democracy allows for consumption rather than savings and investment, which weakens growth. So, the argument here is that in countries where there are dictatorships and the state decides what to invest in, and most of the people don't consume all that much. So, if you look at states like China, consumption is very low, and investment and savings are very high. That this can actually be a boon to future economic performance, because um, you're not constantly consuming, right? And you're actually investing in future assets, future growth, things like that. Uh, Now, I would say this time, this is about average citizens. We're not discussing income equal distribution. We're not discussing the elites. We're just talking about society in general. Here in this model, right, these are different models. Because the poor tend to outnumber the elites, redistribution can occur. And that's what they're suggesting about democracies, is that democracies have redistributive tendencies in them, especially if you look at the European democracies. They have pretty high redistributive tendencies to them. And so consumption can occur, right? Because in a sense, the state got your back, right, in the future. And so, like, if you overspend, there's always going to be that sort of welfare program or redistribution of wealth in the future. And that allows for more conspicuous consumption, fewer investments by elites, right, because their money is being redistributed, and more capital flight in general. Now, the state has a huge incentive to keep the voters happy, right, and shift the money towards them or to reduce taxation, and that can slow investment and R&D, right? So not only does the state have an incentive to keep voters happy because the middle and lower class voters greatly outweigh the elite voters in the system. Um, but they also sort of have an incentive to reduce taxation, right? So that the burden isn't on the poor, it's on the wealthy, right? To have an extremely progressive system. But that again can slow down your economy because you're not investing in R&D, technology, things like that. Some states actually force their citizens to save some, and to an extent, you could say like a 401k, not a 401k, but like a matching contribution at your job or something like that, where they automatically take out a percentage of your check and put it into a savings account. But in China, it's a lot more severe, right? Like you have to put a certain amount of your wages in savings. Um, the authors make this really weird claim, right? They say that because there's no reason to believe that dictatorships would have a longer sort of economic timeline than democratic leaders, that there shouldn't be an argument here, right? But I say, okay, I guess I should walk you through it. Basically, what they're saying is that there we shouldn't believe this little subsection too much because there's no reason to believe theoretically that dictators have a longer economic time horizon than Democrats, right? But I call bullshit. Like Democrats have to be elected every other year in America, right? Not Democrats small d, right? Well, I'm not talking about the Democratic Party. I'm talking about the House of Representatives in the United States has to get reelected every other year. The president every fourth year. The Senate every 6 years. Those are relatively short timelines, right? And so you would actually tend to see more manipulation of the economy to right before elections and things like that, much more short termism than you would see in a dictatorship under my sort of understanding of how dictatorships work, and especially looking at sort of the inner workings at a state like China, where they have a 10, 20, 30-year vision and they update it every 5 years or so. America has nothing like that. We don't have much of a long term strategy. Everything is very like now, today, or next year. What is happening this 6 months, this electoral cycle? So, I have a real problem with their idea that there is not a noticeable difference between dictatorships and democracies when you're looking at long term planning for economics. Okay, Section C, they're talking about autonomy from special interests. There are arguments on both sides, right? Some say that because special interests are so involved in democratic politics, that democratic leaders get really good information, and that they're well informed and that they're likely to put in good policies. Um, Others argue the exact opposite, say that because dictatorships are unfettered by these special interests, they have a lot more free reign to do whatever they like. Um, I'm not really sure where I fall on this. I tend to think that like special interests can be good. I think they've gotten way out of hand in the United States, I guess I would say, but they can definitely be good, and I always think checks and balances are good, but there's not a lot of like long-term research on this, so we don't really know the answer at this point. Anyway, Researchers argue both sides. I don't really know where to fall on this, so we're going to go ahead and skip that part of it, right? Okay, section 2, empirical evidence of the effect of regime change on government performance. This is where they sort of put their money where their mouth is, and they test everything sort of methodologically. And so I guess I should pull up, where did the chart go? Hold on, let me pull up the chart real quick. Giuliani, chapter 9. And I'll sort of walk you again through how to read one of these models. Yeah. All right. Still in chapter 10. Okay, so yeah, first of all, if you want to look at the scatter plots, they're pretty interesting in table 9.4. You can see that obviously there is a relationship right here, and they talk about this sort of diamond relationship or triangle relationship that you tend to see. And so if you look at, say, the bottom left hand, it's level of democracy and percentage of children vaccinated, right? So it looks like as you move up in a democracy, uh, you do tend to get higher rates of vaccination, right, for children. But you also see lumped in the very bottom of the worst democracies, even, or the worst dictatorships, I guess you would say, some of them are very, very, very high performing. China, Singapore, states like that are extremely high performing when it comes to all of these sort of measures of what we would think of as well-being, right? Vaccination, GDP per capita, infant mortality rates. What else do they have? Births attended by a physician. That one's problematic because of doulas, but whatever. I won't get into that. Life expectancy, of course, and then percentage of women receiving prenatal care, right? And so all of these are sort of just generally agreed upon things that are good for your society. But what we tend to see is that dictatorships are all over the board, but some dictatorships perform extremely well in all of these different measures. And so it's hard to really say that, yes, democracy is like a sufficient condition to have good outcomes in these things, but it's not a necessary condition. There are really well performing dictatorships. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for being here for this one. If you have any questions about um, project number 2, let me know, and I'll have some new lectures up very soon. Have a great day. Thanks.